It's Podcast Local from On The Go FM, Episode 4. I'm Jason Norris. If you look at a timeline of your community, you'll notice a few things. First, your community has a beginning. That first point on the timeline is when your community was created. Your community has an origin story. As you move forward on that timeline, you'll notice other significant events that make an impact on your community, perhaps even devastating your community. As you move further along the timeline, you'll arrive at now, the present. Now, the length of the present is sort of nebulous. Sometimes we think of it as this year or this week. Sometimes it's seasons like football or election or simply the fall. Actually, the timeline goes a bit further. Now, it's not as clear because it's the future. The points on the timeline, not events, but their hopes and their dreams and their fears. When something scary happens in the present, it's much harder to see hope. It's easy to collapse into the fear of, well, now what? That timeline is important, especially for people who podcast local. When the future is bleak, you have the power to offer hope. You have the power to build up and encourage the people who listen to your voice. Tell the stories of your community, even stories that haven't happened yet. Tell stories of what could be, or if you're an American Southerner, what might could be. But if you're having trouble seeing a good vision of the future, take a trip into the past. Go back and see how your community dealt with difficulties. You may discover that the fear you face now was not that different than fears your community faced in times past. You might also find a story in that history that will encourage your listeners today. When you look at the previous stories of your community, you'll discover history is not boring. And when you start to research, you'll dig up some things that might surprise you. Well, coming up, a way to think about history that might help you. And then a story about a building and a different way to approach the histories of your community. There's a feature I would like to include in most episodes of Podcast Local, but I need your help. I would like to promote your local podcast. Something like this.
I'm Josh Tollison, and I invite you to listen to my weekly podcast, the 318 Now Podcast. Each week, I have guests from the 318 area and afar who bring informative and entertaining insights into a variety of topics. There are even contests and giveaways. Check out 318nowpodcast.com as well as on Facebook by typing 318 Now Podcast. And yes, you can even find the 318 Now Podcast on iTunes. Give it a listen, 318 Now Podcast.
Now, that's a clever name for a local podcast. The telephone area code that covers northern and central Louisiana. Something that will be well known to the people in that community, even if it's not as well known outside the area. But now you know about it because Josh Tollison sent me that promo. I would also like to promote your local show. Just send me a 30-second promo that tells who you are, what your community is, and where we can listen online. Now, if you would, make it a high-quality file, either an uncompressed WAV or an AIFF file, or even an MP3 if you make sure that the bitrate is higher than you would normally publish for your podcast. And I say that because I'll be taking that file, mixing with my audio, and then compressing it again. And I want it to sound as crisp and clear as possible. Oh, and if you're wondering, yes, keep it clean. This is a family-friendly show. So send me your promos by email, podcastlocal@onthego.fm. Again, that's podcastlocal@onthego.fm. I've got a question for you about you. How did you become you? Think about this for a moment. Did you just appear one day as you are now? You didn't, did you? You didn't just show up. You came from somewhere, a physical place. You were born somewhere. You grew up there or another place, or grew up in several places. You came from some place, in time. You weren't born yesterday. You were born a few decades ago. That time was different. Your world was different. You even understand the world today in a different way than you did then. You experienced life. From the place and time you were born, you grew. You changed. You came to understand things you didn't know before. You didn't just show up. You grew into the person you are now. Who you are today is a mix of nature and nurture, experience and time. You didn't just appear as you are now. And neither did your community. Your community didn't just appear as it is now. Your state, your city, your neighborhood, your church, your team, your community. It didn't just show up. It grew into the place you see today. Your local community today is a mix of time and experiences. Your community has experienced life. From the place and time it was formed, it grew. It changed. It became something complex. Your community became the place it is over the course of time. It wasn't formed yesterday. It was founded a few decades ago, perhaps centuries ago. That time was different. The whole world was different. Those who created your community understood the world in a different way than you understand the world. Your community used to be something else. Over time, it changed. And maybe it changed several times. Your community didn't just show up. It didn't just appear one day as it is now. Think about this. Your community has a history. I believe that most communities deserve to hear an origin story. And I believe most people would enjoy hearing how their community began. But there are other stories. Events happen at different times, and some of those events make a tremendous impact on communities. Bill Nowicki from the local podcast Marietta Stories has a two-part conversation with a historian. They talk about what happened when the Civil War came to Marietta, Georgia. I'll put links in the show notes for this episode. Another way to discover history does not start with events. Instead, consider the things in your community. Mark Bologna of Beyond Bourbon Street did that with his episode about the New Orleans streetcar. And I know when you start researching things, you'll start to discover that those things have a history that's worth telling. So look for those historical markers, old roads, or even old buildings, especially if there's mystery and intrigue. I'll tell you about one of those in a minute. Support for Podcast Local comes from the Satchel podcast player for Android and iPhone. Have you heard about this? The Satchel player makes it easy to send a few dollars to your favorite podcaster while you're listening to the show. Since I've registered Podcast Local with the Satchel player, if you listen to the show in that app and you felt so inclined, you could click a button and make a donation. And the same goes for you and your show too. Just register your show and encourage your listeners to try out the Satchel podcast player. It lets them search their local area for local podcasts, including yours. And as you continue building an audience that knows, that likes, and trusts you, then they'll be able to support the show with a click of a button. Learn more at satchelplayer.com. Again, that's satchelplayer.com. One of the ways to podcast local is to explore the old, strange, curious, uncanny, unusual, mysterious parts of your community. Is there something like that in your community? There was a place like that near the University of Alabama. Roll Tide, by the way. That's where I lived for 7 years while finishing my communication degree, working at Alabama Public Radio, and meeting and marrying my wife. While I was in school, I signed up for a video documentary class. Now, this was in 2003, and we got to use the new, at the time, Final Cut Pro video editor, which was very cool, except for the steep learning curve. We were put into groups and asked to make a documentary about something. There were 3 guys in my group, and we brainstormed a few ideas. Then they started talking about something I had never heard before. As we discussed it, we realized that we had to do a documentary about it. That something was called Old Bryce. Old Bryce was an old abandoned building a few miles from the University of Alabama campus. It was part of Bryce Hospital, a place that treated patients for mental illness. What made Old Bryce intriguing to me was not the building itself, but the draw it had on the students. Year after year after year after year, older students would tell the younger students about the place. And then those students would drive out there, and they would sneak into the building, and then they would get scared, and they would run from the building, and then they would drive away with a story they could tell the next group of students. And apparently there was an alternate ending to the story that happened a lot. They would get caught by security. After all, they were trespassing. It was a cycle that had repeated itself for years, and actually we're not sure how long that went on. So we decided to collect stories from people who had been out to Old Bryce. But that's not all we did. We were curious about the place itself. The story goes that Old Bryce was the first to be built, but later they built another one very close to the campus of the University of Alabama. Well, we researched what we could online, but eventually ended up visiting a library on campus that housed some very old books and documents. And we talked to people. One of the guys in the group knew someone who used to work at Bryce Hospital, so we set up an interview. And the other guy from the group did a little digging and discovered a man who knew the history of the building known as Old Bryce. We also talked to a professor on campus who filled us in on the history of mental illness and its treatment, and especially what happened in Alabama. Overall, it was a great experience for us as students. I mean, it was an interesting story. And there was an intriguing plot twist because that building was not what students believed it to be. And as you'll discover when you start researching things in your community, there are stories you can't tell. What I mean by that is you'll discover snippets of information that seem to be pointing to another layer of the story. But sometimes there's just not enough time or money to continue researching. I mean, at some point, either the semester is coming to an end, or you realize you'll have to publish this, or you'll spend several more months digging into it. By the way, I later uploaded that Old Bryce documentary to YouTube if you'd like to watch, and I included that in the notes as well for this show. Now, remember, if you watch it, I was still on the learning curve for Final Cut Pro when we made that, and we were students, and there is a reason I really love audio stories. History is one way to tell the stories of your community. It's a good way to make connections in your community, too, when you reach out to librarians and professors and historians. And history is just one of 7 ways you can tell the stories of your community, according to the Podcast Local On the Go guide. Sign up for our email newsletter and you can get that guide for free. Just go to podcastlocal.com now to get the guide. That's podcastlocal.com. I'm Jason Norris. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Podcast Local from On the Go FM.